There's notes to take. Get your Bibles out. We're going to be continuing in chapter 14. This is actually week 15. If you remember last week, Pastor Bob talked about this like kind of, what would you call it? Special ops, right? When Jonathan and his armor bearer go all Navy SEAL, right? And they sneak up and they take out a bunch of the enemy all by themselves, right? And it's this awesome, really, really cool account of how Jonathan and his armor bearer with this courage, and they're like, well, if, God's going to be in it, hopefully he is, and they just move forward. All the meanwhile, Saul is where, right? Sipping gin and juice over under the tree, right? And so he's just over there doing nothing, and it's encouraging to him and all this stuff. And so that's where we're at in the story. This is literally just continuing that account. We're going to pick it up in verse 24. The tricky thing, though, is that Saul's over here, right, just sipping juice under a pomegranate tree, while who is fighting the battle? His son. Man, you guys aren't even talking this morning. I know I haven't been up here for like 6 weeks, but so his son's fighting the battle, and Saul's just kind of not really doing anything at this point. We're going to see today, and maybe you've had this situation. Have you ever had the situation where someone in authority, a leader or something, makes a decision? Say your boss makes a decision, and it affects basically everyone but them. You ever have that? And you're like, you idiot, right? Or, yeah, maybe it's a parent, or we've all been in that situation. Today, we're going to see that same thing. Saul's going to make a decision that affects everybody really badly, and it's really got nothing to do with him. And that's the situation we're going to look at this morning. So continuing in 1 Samuel chapter 14, starting in verse 24, I'm going to read this morning out of the New Living, just so you guys know that New Living translation, and it'll be up on the screen. It says, now the men of Israel, this is continuing that account, now the men of Israel were pressed to exhaustion, so they're exhausted that day, because Saul, why were they exhausted? This is the key verse 24. Because Saul, King Saul, had placed them under an oath, saying, let a curse fall on anyone who eats before evening. So he puts this rule in place. Says, nobody eats until tonight. Well, you got an army. I mean, it's crazy. This is kind of a crazy thing that he puts on them. Okay, so a curse fall on anyone who eats before evening, before I have full revenge on my enemies. So no one ate anything all day. 25. Even though they had all found honeycomb on the ground in the forest. Remember what the spies said about the promised land? That it was a land flowing with what? Milk? Like, this is literal stuff. There's honeycomb all. Remember Samson finds honeycomb in the lion's belly, and like there's honey all over the place here apparently, and they find some, and they still don't eat it. Verse 26, they didn't dare touch the honey because they'd all feared the oath that they had taken. But Jonathan had not heard his father's command, and he dipped the end of his stick into a piece of honeycomb and ate the honey. And after he'd eaten it, he felt what? Refreshed. But one of the men saw him and said, your father made the army take a strict oath that anyone who eats food today will be cursed. That is why everyone is weary and faint. So Jonathan's like, oh, my bad, right? He's like, uh-oh, let's see what happens. Verse 29. My father has made trouble for us all. He's like, stupid dad. Like, you ever just thought your parents just dumb, right? And sometimes they are and sometimes they're not, and you just think they are, but this is one of those times. My father's made trouble for us all, Jonathan exclaimed. A command like this only hurts us. See how refreshed I am now that I've eaten this little bit of honey. If the men had been allowed to eat freely from the food they found among our enemies, think how many more Philistines we could have killed. So Jonathan disagrees, right? He's like, this is dumb. Keeps continuing, verse 31. They chased and killed the Philistines all day from Michmash to Ahion, growing more and more faint. So they get fainter and fainter and fainter. That evening, they rushed for the battle plunder. So they'd won the battle, and there's all kinds of stuff everywhere. There's houses that have been abandoned and food and all this stuff. They rushed for the battle plunder, and butchered the sheep, goats, cattle, and calves, but they ate them without draining the blood. Uh-oh, that's bad, right? Those of you that like rare meat, you're okay now. That would have not been okay then. Verse 33, someone reported to Saul, look, the men are sinning against the Lord by eating meat that still has blood in it. That is very wrong, Saul said. Find a large stone and roll it over here. Then go out among the troops and tell them, bring the cattle, sheep, and goats here to me. Kill them here and drain the blood before you eat them. Do not sin against the Lord by eating meat with blood still in it. Continuing, verse 34. So that night, all the troops brought their animals and slaughtered them there. Then Saul built an altar to the Lord, and it was the first of the altars he'd built to the Lord. Continuing, 36, we're almost done. Then Saul said, let's chase the Philistines all night and plunder them until sunrise. Let's destroy every last one of them. His men replied, we'll do whatever you think is best. But the priest said, let's ask God first. Right? Saul's always just charging ahead, doing what he wants, and there's always a priest or someone said, whoa, hold on, bro. Hold on. Shouldn't we ask God first? Let's ask God first. So Saul asked God, should we go after the Philistines? Will you help us defeat them? But God made no reply that day. God didn't answer him then. So what does he do? Okay. What does Saul do? 38. Then Saul said to the leaders, something's wrong. Right? God didn't answer me today, right now, something's wrong. That's what he says. Something's wrong. I want all my army commanders to come here. We must find out what sin was committed today. And I vow by the name of the Lord who rescued Israel that the sinner will surely die, even if it's my own son, Jonathan. But no one would tell him what the trouble was. There was trouble, right? There was trouble. And he's like, this guy, whoever is guilty is going to die, even if it's my own son. Continuing, verse 40. Then Saul said, Jonathan and I will stand over here, and all of you stand over there. So all the army commanders over there, King Saul and Jonathan are on this side, and they basically, equivalent for us, flip a coin. Okay? If it lands on heads, you're guilty. If it lands on tails, we're guilty. So this is what happens. Now cast lots again and choose between me and Jonathan. Jonathan and I over here, and all of you stand over there. And the people responded to Saul, whatever you think is best. 41. Then Saul prayed, O God of Israel, please show us who is guilty and who is innocent. Then they cast sacred lots, and Jonathan and Saul were chosen as the guilty ones. And the people were declared innocent. Continuing, 42. Then Saul said, now let's cast lots again. Choose between me and Jonathan. And Jonathan was shown guilty to be the guilty one. So Saul says, tell me what you've done, Saul demanded of Jonathan. And he says, I tasted a little honey, Jonathan admitted. It was only a little bit on the end of stick. Does that deserve death? Now, ideally, is there any sin in eating honey? No, absolutely not a sin to eat any honey. But what his dad does, okay? Continuing, verse 44. Yes, Jonathan, Saul said, you must die. May God strike me and even kill me if you don't die for this. Like, Saul was nuts, right? I mean, he's crazy. He's crazy. But the people broke in and said to Saul, Jonathan has won this great victory for Israel. Should he die? Far from it. As surely as the Lord lives, not one hair on his head will be touched. For God help him do a great deed today. So the people rescued Jonathan, and he was not put to death. Then Saul called back the army from chasing the Philistines, and the Philistines returned home. We're almost done here. Verse 47. Now, when Saul had secured his grip on Israel's throne, remember, he was a brand new leader here, making mistakes left and right, doing good, doing bad, just kind of trying to figure it all out. When Saul had secured his grasp on Israel's throne, he fought against his enemies in every direction, against Moab and Ammon and Edom and the kings of Zobah and the Philistines, and wherever he turned, he was victorious. He performed great deeds and conquered the Amalekites. Man, I could not say that. Saving Israel from all those who had plundered them. And then it talks about his lineage here, 49. Saul's son included Jonathan and Ishbosheth and Malchishua. He also had two daughters, which we know come into the story later with David. Remember that story? We'll get there. His daughter is Merib, who was older, and Michal. Saul's wife was Ahinoam, and the daughter of Ahimaaz. The commander of Saul's army was Abner. We know an Abner, right? The son of Saul's uncle Ner. Saul's father Kish and Abner's father Ner were both sons of Abiel. 52. The Israelites fought constantly with the Philistines throughout Saul's lifetime. So whenever Saul observed a young man who was brave and strong, he drafted him into his army. That's a lot of text to read, okay? I know that. And I'm going to ask you a question. If you were part of our ministry at Ecclesia, you know the question I'm going to ask you, because I ask it every time I preach, right? And Bob's been asking it of you as of recent too. Do you know what the question is? What do you see out of this, right? What did you see? In this story, as we read this, what stands out to you in this? Like if you were the preacher, right? If we told you this week, hey, sorry, we can't preach, you're up, right? What would you have said? John, yeah, what would you have said? Yeah. Did you hear that? God was an afterthought in all of this. He was an afterthought, and he should not be, right? He should be our forethought, first thought. Absolutely. We're going to talk about that. Good. Maybe we'll ask you to preach next week. No. Yeah. Well, maybe he will. Who knows? Someone else. What do you see in this account? What do you see that stands out to you? Like, really? Or, man, that was good. Yeah, Emmy. He is losing his mind, right? He said Saul's losing his mind here and there, somewhat. And he is, and we know that he does eventually, right? I mean, eventually it just gets nuts. We see the descent. Yeah. What were you going to say? Yeah. I spoiled your book? No, you'll see. You'll see it. You'll see it. What else? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, when we make promises to God, we need to hold true to them, right? Even if they are ludicrous, which is what you had just said. Which that curse was absolutely ludicrous, and everyone knew it. But it was what was said, and that's what they had to go by at that point. It's interesting, I didn't even think about it. It's interesting to me, though, that King Saul, who has all the power, the people could say, no, you're not killing him, and he didn't. So that was interesting to me. Yeah, you had something? Yeah, absolutely. She said Saul just made decisions, rash decisions, and just kind of flew by the seat of his pants and didn't really think about the consequences. Yeah, go ahead. Absolutely. Yeah, she said that that the curse that he brought upon the men brought them to sin, which we're absolutely going to talk about. Yeah, Lori. Yeah. So for recording, for those of you, that sometimes we're going to have to stand up when it's very, very difficult. And the people did that. When they knew it was right, they stood against the dumb thing that was happening. It was Saul in that case, and saved Jonathan. I think, Jennifer, you had one? Yeah, so for those who didn't hear, just the grace and law factor, right? That Saul was kind of represented this legalism, and the people are representing the mercy, and this whole grace versus law conversation. So there's lots going on here. And I want for us always to, when we look at these accounts, just they're historical, and they're these battles and everything, but they have truth for us. It's not just, some people died, Jonathan didn't die, it doesn't really affect us. It does. If we look at these accounts, that we can learn how to be more and more like God, more and more like Jesus as we apply the truths that we see. And these are all great, great things. Some things that stood out to me, I'm going to talk about this morning. There's some things that stood out to me, and you've got those things in your notes there. You can write these things down. The first one is, don't use God, okay? Don't use God, spirituality, or the church to get your way. Don't use God, the church, spirituality. Don't use religion. Don't use those things to get your way. And people do this all the time. I see it like in church leadership world. This happens nonstop. Okay? And this is what Saul was doing. Look at the verse here, verse 24. This is really our key verse. Now the men of Israel were pressed to exhaustion that day because Saul had placed them under an oath, saying, let a curse fall on anyone who eats before evening, before I have full revenge on my enemies. To me, those two words stood out. I and my, right? We're rhyming here. I and my. He's about me. Someone said that God was an afterthought in all of this. That this was just his plan, his desires. Before I have full revenge on my enemy. God's not even mentioned here when he's talking about these things. It's clear that Saul was using this army to accomplish his purposes, his desires, the things that he wanted to happen, because God literally was an afterthought. And then eventually the priest says, whoa, hold on, let's consult God here, right? And the people were warned about this. We talked about this months ago in chapter 8 when they're begging for a king. Remember, Samuel's leading, and they're like, we want a king like the rest. And Samuel's like, y'all don't understand. When we have a king, he's going to use you. He's going to do what he wants. Look, we'll see it right here in chapter 8. If you want to turn back in your Bible to chapter 8, he warned them. Samuel warned them that Saul would do this, that he would take them and basically use them as his little pawns. And this is exactly what Samuel said to them. Verse 10 of chapter 8. So Samuel spoke all the words to the Lord to the people who asked him for a king. And he said, this will be the procedure of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and place them for himself in his chariots and among his horsemen, and they will run before his chariots. He will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and of 50s, and some to do his plowing and to reap his harvest, and to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. 13. So Samuel, remember, Samuel's telling them this is coming, y'all. You really don't want this. And like, yeah, we want it. Continuing. He'll take your daughters for perfumers and cooks and bakers. He'll make the best of you. He'll take the best of your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves and give them to his servants. He'll take a tenth of your seed and of your vineyards and give to his officers and to his servants. 16. He'll also take your male servants and your female servants and the best of your young men and your donkeys and use them for his work. He'll take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves become his servants. Then you will cry out in that day because of your king whom you've chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. Listen, don't use God, spirituality, or the church, or religion, or whatever it is, to get your own way. I said this a few months ago in one of my messages, that God is not a cosmic vending machine. Do you remember that little thing we had? That God is not some cosmic vending machine, and all we have to do is do these, like this certain algorithm that I do this, I go to church, and I pray, and I give a little bit of money, and now God's going to bless me. Like we should not, shall not, must not use God to try to get our own way. We are connected to the Lord to serve him and his purposes. And he has a much better plan, a much better way, a much better purpose for us than we have ourselves. And it's like, how do I say this? Parents, please don't use God as some fearful, evil Lord up in heaven trying to control your kids to do the right thing and the wrong thing. That's making God out to be who he's not. Husbands, like, if you ever have to say, like, I'm the head of the household, you've already lost, right? Like, God put me in charge here. If you ever have to say that, the battle's already been lost. Do not use God, right? Do not use the Bible to try to get your own way. And we can do this. As a young person, I was really good at manipulating the Bible to really say whatever I wanted to say. And I convinced some people to do some really stupid things based on me really tweaking the Bible. Okay? Don't do that. Absolutely do not do that. Don't use God's spirituality of the church to get your way. Number 2 is we are not in the business of revenge. We are not in the revenge business. This is not our job. It's God's job. Okay? It is absolutely God's job. Back to that verse there. Back to that verse. Now the men of Israel were pressed to exhaustion that day because Saul had placed them under an oath, saying, "Let a curse fall on anyone who eats before evening, before I have full," what? "Revenge on my enemies." Now this is a new leader. He wants blood. He wants to show everyone that he's in charge and he's mighty and he's powerful and he's all this. But who's actually doing the fighting? These husbands and fathers, his son, while Saul sits under a tree somewhere. He wants revenge, but other people are paying for it with their lives, right? And a lot of times this happens when we seek out revenge. Maybe not physically, but relationships are destroyed. People's careers are destroyed. People's, their whole life is destroyed when we go after revenge sometimes. And we think it doesn't hurt anyone but them, but absolutely hurts a ton of people. Saul's beef put lots of people's lives on the line. And it was not his business to exact revenge. It was God's. Revenge is not our job. It's God's job. Look at what it says here in Romans chapter 12, verse 17. Never pay back evil with more evil. Do things in such a way that everyone can see that you are honorable. Do all that you can to live in peace with everyone. Dear friends, what do I have highlighted there? Never take revenge. I mean, yeah, it's there, right? Blame God for that one, if you want. It says never take revenge. Leave that to the righteous anger of God, for the scriptures say, I will, not me. God will take revenge. God will pay them back, says the Lord. Instead, so never take revenge. Instead, this is what you ought to do. If your enemies are hungry, what? Feed them. If they're thirsty, give them something to drink. In doing this, and this is like that backhanded way, you're like, right? In doing this, you'll heap burning coals of shame on their heads. Don't let evil conquer you, but conquer evil by doing good. Who's in charge of avenging us? God is, right? God is in charge of avenging us. Let's leave it that way. He's way better at it than we are, okay? Way, way better. And the third thing is this, and this is not really a point, but it's a question, like, whom shall I fear? Whom shall I fear? It's quite clear that the army feared Saul more than they feared God. Because look at what happens in 26. They didn't dare touch the honey because they all feared the oath he had taken. They were afraid that Saul was going to kill them, right? And he would have. But what happens later on? They're not afraid at all of God's law. They're not afraid of all. They're more afraid of a king than they are the King of Kings, right? Look at there in verse 32. That evening, they rushed for the battle plunder and butchered the sheep and goats and cattle and cows, but they ate them without draining the blood. They were so hungry, they didn't even care about the consequences, right? But they feared a man more than they feared God. And this was tragic for them. You ever been there? You ever been there where you're so hungry you don't care about the consequences? I wrote this last week at camp, but this thing actually came to life in my life last night when we went to El Pinguino. There last night, there's this little hot dog cart outside. We had been at Phoenix all day. We got Taylor a new little truck. I come home, we go there to celebrate with ice cream, and outside there's a little taco truck. And I'm like, oh, I'm hungry, right? Y'all been there. You're so hungry you don't care about the consequences? Yeah. You think, I had never heard of these things. Salty Papas. You ever heard of that? Any of you? One. Salty Papas. Never heard of them. I'm like, what are those? Big old basket of fries with sausage and bacon and weenies and cheese and salsa. Yes, it was good last night. Well, I'm struggling today. Right? Look at him. He knows. I was so hungry I knew what was going to happen. Right? So hungry. Didn't care about the consequences. Right? And that, I didn't plan that. God did, obviously, kind of, fortuitous in some kind of way. Like I was so hungry, I'm like, I want it. I don't care what it's going to do to me. It's like Taco Bell. You know what I mean? Like, you just want it. You know later you're going to struggle, that kind of thing. But listen, on a serious note, we do this a lot in our life, don't we? And not just with food. We want to fit in so bad. We find ourselves as doing things we'd never do. We don't really care about the consequences. A young girl wants to be loved so bad. The first boy that shows her any attention, she throws herself to, gives up all kinds of things. Friends no longer friends, because you're so hungry for that thing. You don't care about the consequences. This is real life stuff, right? This happens all the time. So hungry for that thing, so hard pressed to get whatever that thing is that you want, that we really don't care about what's coming with it. And that's a shame. This is a common issue for us. It's absolutely common. We're so concerned, so committed to the life that we have now, that really we really fear missing out more than we fear God. Or think about it this way. Maybe you're so busy, your calendar's so full, right, that instead of, you don't have time to do a quiet time, God, because you got laundry, right? And we just got to do laundry. I can't do a quiet, I have to get to work early. Or maybe you're a family that's kids are split. You've split up and you only get your kids on Sunday, and Sunday's family day, and so they really don't have time to go to church. Maybe we're so committed to things of the world that we really have no time for God. And we're fearing missing out, or we're fearing these things of the world. We're so committed to these things of the world that we just kind of let God kind of go off to the sideline. And these things hit us. They're true for many of us. And it's not something I like to talk about, but it's just the truth. Many of us put pretty much everything else before God. That He just gets the leftovers, the scraps of our schedule. And that's a shame, and we shouldn't be that way. The last lesson here that I want to share is a leadership lesson, and I've decided as I preach through this 1 Samuel series, I'm just going to try to include a leadership lesson, because the three main leaders in this account, we've got Samuel the prophet, great leader. He did some good stuff, he did some bad stuff. We've got Saul, okay leader, did some good stuff, mostly bad stuff. And then who comes next? You remember? King David, great leader, did some really bad stuff too. I want for us to, and we're all leaders at some point. Okay, I know some of you are, well, I'm not a leader. Yeah, you are. Maybe you lead at work. Maybe you lead your home. Maybe you're a leader on your football team. Maybe you're a leader in the community. You're on some executive board doing something. We're all leaders. Here's what I want to ask you, and it's up there on the screen. Do you lead from love and authority, or do you lead through power and fear? Because those are completely different things. Saul obviously led through fear and power, right? That he had the power to make these decisions, and you better fear him. If that's the kind of leadership, like if people are following you and doing what you say because they fear you, whether it's your kids or your workers or the people on your, that's not how Jesus led. Jesus led with authority, right? Which is a bit different than power. He led with love. He led by example. Think about his interaction with the Pharisees and how he got after them, and they were always arguing. If I was him, lightning bolt, bam, you're gone, right? That's fear and power. You do that once, people aren't going to mess with you. You send a lightning bolt out of the sky and zap some dude, word's going to get around real quick. People are going to do what you say, right? They're going to respect you because you got power, and they're going to fear you. He could have done that, and that's why I wasn't Jesus, right? Because I would have done that a lot. Boom, you're done. Boom, you're done. Leaders are that way. Y'all know, some of you have bosses who are that way. Some of you know leaders that are that way. Jesus was not that way. He led through love and example and had all the authority in the universe, right? To zap somebody, and he didn't. Okay? He didn't use it. He didn't lead through fear, but through love and example. And that's what we need to do as leaders as well. Worship team, you guys can come forward. I know we're close to being done here. I want for us to close today, and I know that these lessons that we talked about this morning are all kind of negative, and I get that. Unfortunately, a lot of the rest of the book in Saul's life, he keeps failing and he keeps failing and he keeps failing. But we can learn from failures, can't we? Right? We can learn from the failures of others in order to learn how not to be. Right? We can learn what not to do by someone else making a mistake and saying, I'm not doing that. And so that's kind of where we're going to be for a while. Learning what not to do as King Saul continues to do stupid things and stuff like that. But I don't want you to think that this is like this bummer, because it's not. Because in leadership, as I'll tell you what, when we planted Ecclesia, I learned more from my failures than I did the great things that we did. I learned how to be a leader, learned a lot of different stuff through just messing up and making mistakes and learning from those things. And so that's what we're going to do over the next few months, is look at those things. Let me pray, and then we're going to continue to worship through song.